Hey guys, it's Divest. My friend Armpit Boss wrote a top 5 list for his favorite rifles, so I thought I would share it with everyone and add my own. Since his favorites are all old-school military weapons, I decided to limit myself to that topic.
I also found another voice to go with Armpit Bosses to delineate our choices better. Now let's get started. Number 5. Johnson Model, 1941. Although something of a failure compared to its competitor, the M1 Garand, the Johnson rifle was more proof that the United States was further ahead in military and industrial technology than other world powers. Chambered in the same caliber as the Garand, and similarly clip-fed into an internal magazine, the Johnson differed in that it could hold 10 rounds of .30-06, as opposed to the M1's 8. The unique cyclical magazine was compatible with existing Springfield M1903 clips, and could also be topped off with individual rounds, whereas the Garand needed to be completely empty to reload at all. It also used a short recoil mechanism not dissimilar to the later AR-15, which is not a surprise as Melvin Johnson was a partner of Eugene Stoner. However, it had many issues as well, notably its highly complex cyclical magazine and recoil operation, as well as a delicate barrel that also required a unique spike bayonet. Johnson argued that the M1 was too simple and prone to accidental disassembly, but the simpler Garand understandably won out. Despite this, it did not stop the Johnson from earning a favorable reputation with Allied forces, most famously the 1st Special Service Brigade, who preferred them over the heavier bar, and specialized units from the U.S. Marine Corps.
Number 5. GPK Model, 1888. First off, what I really like about the 88 is that even though it was substandard by the time of the First World War, it was generally superior to most other service rifles from the war in some ways. It uses a 5-round en-bloc clip or internal magazine superior to both the French Lebel and Berthier. The bolt is smooth compared to the Mannlicher straight pulls, Carcano, the Mosin, and even Mauser-derived rifles. The 88 also uses a rimless cartridge, the first mass-produced service rifle to use a rimless cartridge and still relatively uncommon by the First World War. Importantly, the 88 has a strong, reliable action unlike the Lee Enfield. The 88 wasn't just a substandard weapon on its way out during the First World War. It was the primary rifle of the Ottoman Empire and China, with derivatives serving in the Netherlands, Romania, Greece, and Portugal, to name a few, until after the Second World War. In fact, it is the oldest service weapon that was never made technologically obsolete. It's one of 3 bolt actions that are still in military use as sniper rifles, along with the Gewehr 98 and the Pattern 1913. You could make the argument that these are all Mauser rifles because they're all derivative of the Mauser 71 action. But they diverged between Mauser's own improvements, Schlegelmilch and Springfield, and Enfield improved actions. Even though the 88 was the second smokeless service rifle, it's still relevant after almost 140 years. While the French got the title of first in this case, their rifle was obsolete within 2 years. Finally, the 1888 also developed a lot of the technology with the magazine system of the Garand, such as the omnidirectional clip and top ejection. The Mannlicher 86 doesn't count because it drops out the bottom instead of being ejected from the top.
Number 4. Krag-Jørgensen. A contemporary of more famous European bolt-action service rifles, the Krag holds a somewhat unique place in military history. Famously, Krag rifles were in the hands of American personnel in a handful of Gilded Age conflicts such as the Spanish-American, Filipino, and Boxer Wars, where it took the role of the first standard-issue bolt-action rifle of a nation reeling from civil war. These Springfield variants, designated M1892, are the ones I know the most about to speak on authoritatively. Chambered in the unusual 30-40 cartridge, the Krag was an overall oddity. Rather than loading through the top with a clip, the Krag used a side-mounted loading gate that flipped open from the top. The major advantages to this was the ability to simply drop a handful of loose rounds into the magazine, or top off while the bolt was locked closed. It is also well known for its extremely smooth bolt, which has allowed it to remain as the favored rifle by Norwegian competitive shooters to this day. Despite these features, the Krag was not very well liked by those who wielded it, and the U.S. military ultimately phased it out after only a decade. The loading gate was awkward to open and close, and the lack of a clip or guide meant that soldiers had to pull individual rounds out of their cartridge belts. This made it difficult to load while under fire, as evidenced by the large amount of unfired .30-40 dropped on the ground at the base of San Juan Hill. That same battle, the Krag showed its weakness against its more prolific cousin, the Mauser rifle, prompting Springfield Armory to reproduce the Spaniard's rifle as the M1903.
Number 4. Mauser Modell 1898. Of course, after all that time spent talking about how great the Gewehr 88 is, you'd have to have something really impressive to displace it so soon after adoption. Paul Mauser did exactly that. He made a highly accurate rifle action that was strong enough to handle any ammunition, while also having top-grade ergonomics and, most importantly, being cheap enough to mass-produce. Additionally, the roller coaster sights on the original Gewehr 98 are my favorite iron sights on a military rifle. There is a shorter list of countries that haven't used a Mauser 98 or derivative as a standard service weapon. I didn't look through all of the countries, but the only ones that stood out to me as possibly not using the Mauser at some point were Myanmar and Mongolia. They might have used the Mauser, but I haven't found any evidence of it. The Mauser is as good as Russians say the Kalashnikov is. It was produced in greater numbers too. Britain and the United States famously reverse-engineered the Mauser after having to fight against them, as did the Belgians, Poles, Spanish, and Romanians. The Czechs selected the Mauser when they gained independence too. It also served as the basis for sniper rifles, hunting rifles, and anti-material rifles starting in the First World War and continuing to this day owing to its strong locking action and accuracy. Another often overlooked feature of the Mauser 98 is that it's extremely cheap compared to contemporary designs too. For instance, the Mosin Nagant is a piece of crap that is not only worse by every performance metric, but it's also more expensive and slower to produce.
Number 3. Lorenz Rifled Musket. While not as prominent as the Springfield and Enfield rifle muskets, the Lorenz was the third most used longarm of the American Civil War. Designed and built in the Austrian Empire, the Lorenz continued the Germanic tradition of issuing long Jaeger-type rifles to their armies in order to engage the enemy from beyond their range. Although superficially similar to the aforementioned rifles, it had a pillar breech that tightly compressed the bullet against the rifling when rammed. This afforded the Lorenz better accuracy at longer ranges at the cost of needing more frequent cleaning. In spite of its global popularity, it did suffer from a number of setbacks throughout its development and service lives. The Vienna arsenal was unable to produce enough on their own, and thus initially outsourced production to independent gunsmiths before soon rescinding the contracts in disappointment. The contract Lorenzes varied greatly in metallurgical quality, stock material, and even bore diameter. This earned it a somewhat controversial reputation when exported to the United States, with some regiments believing their Vienna rifles to be superior to Springfield's, while others regarded them as substandard. The latter was not helped by the U.S. government's attempt to rectify the issue by reboring many Lorenzes from the factory .54 caliber to the American standard .58 caliber. This not only thinned the rifling, but the pillar breech was not designed to accept the mini bullet used by the Union. Regardless of its status in historical memory, the Lorenz was a mainstay of both the Austrian and American armies in the late 19th century.
Number 3. Pattern 1914 Enfield. The model 1917 Enfield is in my opinion the best service rifle of the First World War, and it's not even close. It combines a sturdy and dependable design taken from Mauser by way of the Springfield with some of the best ergonomics of any rifle of the war. If I had to choose one single bolt-action rifle during the First World War to arm my army, this would be it, even though some other rifles had some minor advantages to them. Now, the Pattern 13 follows in a long tradition of Britain copying rifle designs from Germany decades after they were designed, and then making minor improvements. But what is unique about the Mauser Enfield series is that since they were forced to return to the Lee Enfield because of economics and timing, the British propagandist has to shit-talk the Pattern 13. So not only do you get a handy and fully capable battle rifle, But you also get the comedy of British propagandists shit-talking their only good domestic rifle design to cope about the fact they couldn't use a good rifle during the war. The aperture sights on the Pattern 13 also served as the basis for the next century of Western rifle and machine gun sights. The only reason we're not using them anymore is because optics have displaced irons. Additionally, the Pattern 13 and its derivatives remain the most popular bolt-action rifles for American FUDs through Winchester and Remington, in addition to serving as popular military sniper rifles. Though Barrett finally broke that tradition in 2019.
Number 2. Sharps Rifle. Although there had been numerous attempts before to mass-produce a breech-loading military rifle, Christian Sharps was perhaps the first to be successful. Designed prior to the American Civil War, Sharps rifle was truly ahead of its time in the era of smoothbore, muzzle-loading firearms. The primary feature of the Sharps was its ability to be loaded from the rear, allowing the rifleman to load much faster and easier, while also remaining completely in cover. As a result, it earned widespread popularity among skirmishers and cavalrymen for its high rate of fire and ergonomics. While not the only breech-loading rifle of the war, it became the most famous from its use by the Union Army's green-clad sharpshooter units. The Sharps, along with the repeating Henry rifle, was feared by Confederate soldiers for its ability to fire volleys of precise and rapid shots from concealed positions. In turn, the South tried and failed to produce breech loaders on the same scale due to their lack of quality metal and industry. Even after the war, Sharps rifles remained popular on the frontier for hunting big game, as well as in Japan during the Bushin War, with many being converted to metallic cartridges. However, with the death of Christian Sharps, his company dissolved. The Sharps was too expensive to become a service rifle, and many countries opted to convert existing rifle muskets into breech loaders instead.
Number 2. Model 1918. Browning Automatic Rifle. The Browning automatic rifle gets derided constantly in absurd fashion. Depending on who you ask, it's a bad rifle or a bad machine gun. In reality, the Bar was the first automatic rifle that didn't obviously and egregiously suck. Even though normies recognize the Shosha is bad, if only because it is ugly. You still get a lot of people talking about how forward-thinking the Russians were with the Fedorov Avtomat and the French with the RSC rifle, erroneously describing these two weapons as assault rifle and battle rifle respectively. And yet both of these guns are actually automatic rifles, and they're dog shit compared to the Bar. Bad sights, bad mechanisms, bad ammunition. And rather than being deployed in the role of assault rifle or service rifle, they were deployed as automatic rifles and light machine guns, with one issued as a team weapon. The only distinction is the fact they were used by the medic in Battlefield 1, while the Bar was used by the support. By comparison, when it was introduced, the Bar allowed for one man to match the firepower of 8 riflemen with a weapon that was just as handy as the standard bolt-action rifle and could sustain fire as well as a Lewis gun. Since no one had quick change barrels, the only infantry weapon that could outgun a Bar was the MG-0815. During the Second World War, there were better light machine gun designs, but that didn't really matter since American rifle squads carried 3 Bars and automatic rifles, which gave them greater firepower and maneuverability than their enemies, which typically lacked motorized transportation and automatic service rifles. So the Bar was still relevant and potent during the Second World War and beyond. Also, unlike guns jerked off for being revolutionary during the Second World War like the Sturmgewehr, the Bar action remains in use to this day on the FN mag.
Number 1. Winchester Model 1895. Winchester. Repeating Arms prided itself on being a lever-action company in spite of improvements in firearms technology. Much like the ill-fated Model 1887 shotgun, the M1895 was something of a last act of defiance against the proliferation of bolt-action rifles. As such, this was John Browning's last lever-action rifle design and incorporated elements from both loading mechanisms. Highly unusual for lever rifles, the M1895 made use of a 5-round box magazine as opposed to the tubes used by its predecessors. This allowed for faster and more ergonomic loading by means of a stripper clip, which attracted the attention of both the US and Russian imperial governments. The former was largely unimpressed by its military performance, with small numbers chambered in 30-40 delivered to forces stationed in the Philippines, where it fared poorly in the humid weather. President Theodore Roosevelt disagreed and was an avid user of the unique repeater, having owned a custom model chambered in the massive 405 cartridge, which he dubbed Big Medicine for its ability to strike down most big game animals. The Russian Empire also ordered large numbers of these repeaters in 7.62 by 54 rimmed and were issued during the First World War. Although well liked by Russian soldiers, it had little time to prove itself in combat, as revolution forced the empire to withdraw from the war. Thus, the M1895 was made obsolete rather quickly, with most of them relegated to civilian and law enforcement use until production ceased.
Number 1. United States Model 1 Carbine Caliber 30. The M1 carbine, I think, personally encapsulates the superiority of the American military better than anything else. It was a completely revolutionary design which was only surpassed by later American designs like the M16, and most importantly, it wasn't some theoretical design or experiment. It was standard issue, the most common American small arm of the Second World War. Not even specifically to frontline infantry, but as a defensive weapon for rear echelons. Sure, they also had the Garand, but everyone had already been pushing towards automatic rifles during the interwar era, even if they couldn't actually standardize them. Not only did America flex on the fact they had better rifles than everyone else, but even their rear echelons were now better armed than the premier riflemen of other nations, because they not only had the resources, but the foresight to design the most modern rifle of the war. All you can do is cope. That's why the Wearaboos and the Ziaboos try to clutch their pearls and redefine what an assault rifle is. Regardless of how much you cope about the stopping power of 30 carbine cartridges, what is really important is that the carbine was better than submachine guns in every way. The carbine was also a very enduring and influential design. The fact that the Kalashnikov was originally adopted as a rear echelon weapon makes me think they were mimicking the carbine rather than the Sturmgewehr, which was pushed to infantry. Additionally, it wasn't until the 60s that the AK-47 was a refined enough design to serve as the primary rifle of America's enemies. Before that, you had the SKS, which was worse than the carbine and Garand in most ways, a submachine gun that was worse than the M2 carbine in its niche, or a bolt-action rifle. So the M1 carbine effectively ensured American small arms dominance up until Armalite cemented it for the next few generations. Thanks for listening. Funny how Mauser and Winchester kept on appearing in my list. By the way, Winchester was the primary contractor for the bar, even though the design was owned by Colt, and they put the finishing touches on the design. They also made the best Enfield rifles of the First World War in the carbine.